President Trump is using a carrot and stick approach. The incentive for Russia to stop the war is potentially helps the economy, brings Russia in from the cold. But I haven't yet seen any reference to America using a stick. Because, for example, when Tomahawk missiles, those cruise missiles that had the potential for America to help Ukraine, they would hurt the Russian economy. They would strike Russian oil and energy infrastructure. And it's pretty clear that would hurt the Russian economy even more. So Trump could force Putin's hand and get him round the table. It's not clear yet that he's forcing them to do that.
We are not going anywhere. Fighting talk from the NATO chief last night as foreign ministers gathered in Brussels to make sense of what I suppose was an extraordinary 48 hours of smoke and mirrors diplomacy from the Kremlin. Mark Rutte warned Moscow the alliance is ready and willing to protect its territory after Vladimir Putin accused its leaders of meddling in the Ukraine peace negotiations and indeed threatened military action. Meanwhile, the European Commission has tabled a proposal to seize frozen Russian assets to fund a €90 billion reparations loan for Kiev. So this ramped up rhetoric comes amidst confusion, I suppose, surrounding the latest round of talks to end the war. A planned meeting between Steve Witkoff and Ukrainian negotiators was abruptly called off yesterday, only for us to hear in the past few hours from the White House it's back on, now in Miami. It comes after the US envoy's 5-hour sit-down with President Putin failed to result in any breakthrough. But speaking last night, Donald Trump insisted the Russian leader does want to end the war.
He would like to end the war. That was their impression. Now, I think he'd like to get back to dealing a more normal life. I think he'd like to be trading with the United States of America, frankly, instead of, losing thousands of soldiers a week.
So has any progress been made in the past few days, or are we back to square one? Joining us to help untangle the diplomatic web of statements and counter-statements is the former RAF Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Sean, good morning.
Good morning to you, James.
What's your assessment of the current state of play? Is Moscow simply stalling for time?
Well, I think the key is, James, we've been covering this war for well over 3 years now. I've recently come back from Ukraine. It's very difficult to see how you can negotiate a peace unless both sides are willing to talk. And it's pretty clear at the moment that Russia is on the front foot. It is winning on the battlefield very, very slowly at huge cost, but it is grinding forward. And therefore, what Trump seems to be trying to do in bring the war to an end, clearly he wants peace, clearly believes it's in both sides' interests. But so far, what we're hearing, it looks more like a surrender document. And that is not something that Ukraine is going to be able to sign up to, particularly having invested so much in the war so far.
And it's this question of territory that still appears to be the key sticking point with Kiev refusing Russian demands to surrender land it holds in Donetsk in the east. Do you think we can expect any shift on that? And if so, how?
Well, I think the key point here, James, is that I think there's going to be some very, very difficult compromises that need to be made, particularly by Ukraine. President Trump famously said that they didn't have any cards, that it's not a game of cards, but that when it comes to negotiation, you need to have some areas where you have benefits and strength. And it's very difficult to see how Ukraine has many of those at the moment. I think the key thing is that Ukraine almost certainly will have to give up territory as part of the deal, but you don't do that negotiation in public. If you do that, all Russia will do is take that ceding of territory and then ask for more. You have to sit around a table. You have to force, in a way, President Putin to actually come to the table. And that's what I don't really understand. President Trump is using a carrot and stick approach. The incentive for Russia to stop the war is potentially helps the economy, brings Russia in from the cold. But I haven't yet seen any reference to America using a stick. Because, for example, when Tomahawk missiles, those cruise missiles that had the potential for America to help Ukraine, they would hurt the Russian economy. They would strike Russian oil and energy infrastructure. And it's pretty clear that would hurt the Russian economy even more. So Trump could force Putin's hand and get him round the table. It's not clear yet that he's forcing them to do that.
Yeah, and it appears the threat of Tomahawk missiles was lifted, perhaps because of fears of escalating conflict further from Washington and perhaps NATO too. Just talking about those negotiations, there have been suggestions that Steve Witkoff, as a real estate mogul, is simply out of his depth here. He's being outplayed. That negotiating deals for developments in Manhattan or Miami is no training for negotiating the future of a sovereign nation state. As a military man, do you think those criticisms are fair, or is he underestimated?
One of the challenges I think I spent most of my military career, we've been in sort of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the like, and fighting can only take you so far, but nearly all wars end in some form of negotiation. Military action is a means to an end, it's not an end in itself. And the problem we have, James, at the moment is that Ukraine really doesn't have any good options available on the table. I think there are really three options available, one of which is the West continues to support Ukraine as is, but bluntly, despite the huge investment of money and weapons, Ukraine is losing, and if the war continues for another 2 or 3 years, it's quite possible Russia will actually take the territory that we're talking about Ukraine ceding. The second option available is that the Europeans, potentially America, increase military support. You say that would risk escalation. Yes, it might risk escalation, but quite frankly, you've got to stand up to a bully, and there are some profound implications if Russia does prevail in Ukraine for the rest of Europe. And the third option, if you don't want to do the first two, is you've got to negotiate. Now, there are no good choices in that negotiation, and I think what President Trump's doing, he alone in the world has the power and influence to force President Putin to the table. The challenge is, at the moment, he seems unlikely to actually put his shoulder behind the stick element of that. I hope that becomes part of his negotiating strategy.
And we Mark Rutte yesterday, he said there's only one person in the world who can break the deadlock, and that's Donald Trump. Zelensky, he's also admitted his greatest fear is Trump losing interest in the peace process. And well, we heard a clip from Trump in the queue there, who sounded not totally sort of checked out of the negotiations, but one does wonder whether that kind of nightmare scenario is now a step closer to becoming reality. I suppose the other threats that could be used, you mentioned the Tomahawk missiles. The EU's also proposed using its emergency powers to seize frozen Russian assets. They say that would fund a €90 billion reparations loan for Kiev. Secondary sanctions on oil is another factor that could be considered. May we just zoom in on the battlefield itself? Because I'm interested, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that Russia, in your assessment, is having success. And that's indeed what the Kremlin says as well. It says it's captured key towns, key cities in that eastern region in recent weeks and days. Militarily speaking, do you think the pendulum has swung decisively in Moscow's favour, or is it really just inching forward too slowly to sustain this over a long period of time?
Yeah, it's a great question, James. I mean, the harsh reality is that you can play around with numbers all you like. I heard one of the Ukrainian leaders talking about Russia's only taken sort of 1.5% of Ukrainian territory over the last few years, and at huge cost, and that's true. But if you look at the regions that President Putin's made clear he's trying to take, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and for the benefits of your listeners, this is a belt of land that links Russia to Crimea. It's quite reasonable that those are the main objective. Now, at the moment, it looks like Russia is about to take Pokrovsk, if it hasn't taken it already. And that leaves three sort of border towns, Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. And if Russia was to try and take those by force, most analysts believe it will be about 3 years before they could do that, based on the progress they've made so far. But it also, most analysts believe that Russia would be able to take them eventually because it's got greater resources than Ukraine has, particularly in manpower. When I was last out there, one of the things hurting Ukraine is it's a fraction of the size of Russia. It also has a fraction of the size of the military. And Ukraine, let's be clear, cannot get drawn into a battle of attrition. The old war where you both met on a battlefield, had a cup of tea and went at each other. The biggest side, the biggest army wins. And at the moment, that's Russia. The only advantage that Ukraine has, apart from its courage and its huge resilience, is that it uses Western high-tech weapons. That gives it an advantage on the battlefield. If those don't continue to flow, things look pretty bleak for Ukraine.
And Sean, I just want to ask you, finally, you served in the RAF as a high-ranking officer and Air Vice Marshal. I assume you must have engaged with NATO. It is extraordinary that the US, that once led the alliance, that forged its direction, is now seen as almost a competing entity, or at least one with different priorities, in such a short space of time. Do you think Putin has succeeded in driving a wedge between the two?
Well, there's little doubt in my mind that one of Putin's objectives was to drive a wedge between the US and the EU. I mean, I think we have to be a little bit careful here as well, though, that NATO is about preserving NATO, and Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So we've got to be careful to make sure we don't get those two joined together. I think one of the things about the negotiation ultimately will be that peace will
I think
come.
my point was that they don't really seem to be acting in tandem when it comes to NATO.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure that's true. I mean, when Trump first came to power, he watched 2/3 of NATO not paying their 2%, which everybody had agreed to do. When he came back in power recently, most of NATO was still not paying its way. And he quite rightly, I think, felt that America shouldn't be shouldering the burden for Europe. And actually, by saying, look, this is a European problem, not a NATO problem, and he's actually stepping back a little bit from NATO, what he's doing is forcing Europe to spend more money on defence and be more credible and robust. And as a military guy, I think that's true. I think we've had 35 years of wars of choice since the end of the Cold War. We've underinvested in defence, and actually this is a wake-up call. If Ukraine was to fall, where next? Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And bluntly, European security starts to be threatened. We need to do something about that quickly. You need to rebuild your armed forces. This has been a dramatic wake-up call. So I don't think America's going to walk away from NATO, but I do think it's a very important chapter of NATO's history.
Sean, thank you very much indeed. That's the former Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell sharing his military and diplomatic analysis.